Hello and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. Are you bogged down by having to manually manage data access controls, repeatedly move and copy data, and create audit reports to prove compliance? How much time could you save if those tasks were automated across your cloud platforms? Immuta is an automated data governance solution that enables safe and easy data analytics in the cloud. Their comprehensive data-level security, auditing, and de-identification features eliminate the need for time-consuming manual processes, and their focus on data and compliance team collaboration empowers you to deliver quick and valuable data analytics on the most sensitive data to unlock the full potential of your cloud data platforms. Learn how they streamline and accelerate manual processes to help you derive real results from your data at dataengineeringpodcast.com/Immuta, that's IMMUTA, and get a 14-day free trial. And when you're ready to build your next pipeline or want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends over at Linode. With their managed Kubernetes platform, it's now even easier to deploy and scale your workflows or try out the latest Helm charts from tools like Pulsar, Pachyderm, and Dagster. With simple pricing, fast networking, object storage, and worldwide data centers, you've got everything you need to run a bulletproof data platform. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode, that's LINODE, today and get a $60 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Rob Colley about Microsoft's Power BI platform and his work at Power Pivot Pro to help users employ it effectively. So, Rob, can you start by introducing yourself?
Hi, I'm Rob Colley, and I sort of started my career at Microsoft, 13 years there working on various data technologies like Excel and BI. For the last 10 years, I've been outside of Microsoft running a consulting practice dedicated to the Microsoft data platform. Yeah, just sort of an all-around data enthusiast.
And do you remember how you first got into the area of data management?
Mostly by accident. There's always a funny story here. Like, I never really set out to do this. This wasn't like a career goal or anything like that. I was just a foot soldier recruited by Microsoft, and put where they wanted me in 1996. But via reorg and all kinds of other accidents, I ended up sitting next to the Excel team. And then when the product I was working on at that time got canceled, it was like the most obvious move was just to be absorbed by the Excel team. And on a personal front, I had, in the late 90s at Microsoft, I had developed the fantasy football hobby/addiction back before football analytics was a thing. It's back before there were even websites dedicated to fantasy football. Like, it was all like done, all the scoring, even we were doing it in Excel. And so in the beginning, Excel and what I started to later think of as analytics and business intelligence, my personal interest in it started mostly from like using Excel to dominate my friends who weren't doing anything like this. People who fashioned themselves as big football fans but didn't actually care about the data. And that competitive advantage was pretty intoxicating. That was sort of like my gateway drug into the world.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how ubiquitous Excel is and the capabilities that it provides for people to be able to answer questions and analyze things and do various data-oriented tasks without necessarily thinking about it in that context, because it's just another portion of the Microsoft Office suite, and it's fairly natural to start using it for, adding in formulas, and you can go quite far. And there are some pretty amazing things people have done with Excel. So it's interesting that that's where you got your start, is with that team. So I'm wondering if you can give a bit of an overview about the Power BI product and some of the ways that your experience with Excel has helped you in being able to work on guiding that product and with helping users now and in your consultancy to be able to leverage it effectively.
Let's start with something that I do. I very commonly will use this as an introduction if I'm speaking like at a conference, for instance, back when we did those in person. If you ever end up seeing me and speaking at a conference, well, I will have ruined this joke ahead of time. But the audience, I asked them, so what is the most popular programming language? The obvious answers come out pretty quickly. C, Java. Someone inevitably suggests SQL, which I think is clever, and it's a correct answer. But the real answer to the question, and it's not even close, is that Excel formulas are the number one most popular programming language in the world. They pass every single definition, every single criteria of what constitutes a programming language. It's just a functional programming language, which, there are other things like Lisp, for instance, that are also functional programming languages. Excel is a programming language. It's a programming platform. It's got its own, it's essentially almost like its own IDE. Excel is the runtime library as well for this programming language. And all the other programming languages in the world, in terms of the number of people who are using them, add them all together, they still don't come close to Excel. So it's a really interesting way to view the world. Once you start to understand that the people who are slinging spreadsheets in business are actually these under the radar business programmers and they're developers, it changes the way that you look at the ecosystem of what's going on. And this is building towards your specific question, which is sort of how does Power BI fit in? The other thing is that when I got into BI, when I was introduced to business intelligence, and in the early 2000s, I was tapped to run the Excel's investment in business intelligence. Business intelligence was still a very hot term back then. It was fresh. We put a lot of effort in Excel 2007 into BI. And so I had to get a crash course on BI and what all that meant. Fast forward a number of years, and a lot of this experience gained outside of Microsoft. It doesn't matter. The traditional BI investments, it doesn't matter how much money or time a company has spent on traditional BI software and projects. When you go and you see how it's actually being used in the end, it's all just being exported back to Excel. These notions that we produce these reports and then business users will look at the reports and then make a decision based off of that report is a fiction that I believed. I was part of it. These things are really just query interfaces in the end for the Excel users. And once you kind of make your peace with this, you make your peace with the fact that the Excel user, and really the advanced Excel user, it's not like everyone that uses Excel is doing this sort of thing, but the Excel user is the crucial demographic in every business in terms of data. And Power BI, when we were developing it, Power BI was built from the ground up with this assumption in the foreground of our mind, which is that for something to truly revolutionize, for something to truly change the world, it has to be an upgrade, and a major upgrade over Excel. And it has to be learnable by this particular flavor of Excel user, who, by the way, you can identify them very quickly. Anyone that uses the VLOOKUP function in Excel, or any of its cousins. There's a family of lookup functions. Anyone who uses those lookup functions and or anyone that uses pivot tables, that's like the 5% of the business audience. They are shadow IT. They're the real BI and the real reporting for the world. That was the original mission, was to build something to bring the robustness of real BI to the Excel crowd. As flexible as Excel is and as widely known as it is not scalable. Every new question that you get asked requires you to re-engineer your spreadsheet. It is not nimble. Even just pumping the most recent data through your spreadsheet report. Once you have a sufficient portfolio of these, you spend your whole week just maintaining your past work. So you end up almost like disincentivized from innovation. The last thing you would need is to build another spreadsheet that people like, that then you have to maintain. So that was the mission. I think that's important background, but your question is, how does it actually work in the world? What is it, mission is one thing, but what does it actually ended up as? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's definitely useful context. And I think it's interesting to go from there to, discuss some of the ways that you would actually use Power BI and maybe do some comparison to the broader business intelligence market and ecosystem. And what are some of the factors that will lead someone to choose Power BI over something like a Looker or some other business intelligence platform that has fancy dashboards when, as you said, at the end of the day, it's mostly just going to all end up back in Excel and somebody doing some further analysis on the reports that are generated.
Yeah. So there's sort of like two distinct generations of BI tools that are worth talking about. There's the previous generation, and this includes a lot of Microsoft stuff. A lot of Microsoft tools fall into this previous generation category. There's tools like SQL Server reporting services and SQL Server analysis services. When I talk about sort of the failures of traditional BI, I absolutely include those two previous products in that failure. They were part of that industry. There's others like that from that generation, like Cognos and Business Objects were dominant for a while, and they're very much the same sort of characteristics as those other Microsoft tech. And then there's this new wave, some of the names that you've mentioned, Looker, Tableau, Power BI. First, let's differentiate between Power BI and the traditional wave. I actually think it's differentiated from the traditional wave even more so than its competitors in this second wave. The second wave competitors have more in common with the old tools than what they let on. It's just really funny for me because I was a software engineer who helped build a lot of these old tools. I helped create the dysfunctional previous generation. So it's almost like I'm atoning for the sins these days. And there's something about the way that software was built. All of that software, all of that traditional software was built in a way that dictated a very, very, very heavy waterfall type of methodology. Like everything starts with requirements gathering. Everything starts with writing this gigantic requirements document. Lots and lots of meetings, lots of time is chewed up just producing the specification. And it turns out the specification isn't worth very much. It's incomplete. It contains all kinds of misunderstandings. It gets reinterpreted down the line by the developers. It's a massive dysfunction. But the thing is, you can't work any other way because the tools move too slowly. Like you can't sit in the room as a business stakeholder. You can't sit in the room with the developer of the traditional solution and watch them work. Days would go by before you had anything to provide any sort of feedback on. You do this asynchronously. You do it via requirements docs. And even the creation of those documents sometimes takes weeks, maybe longer, maybe months. The number one differentiator right off the bat about Power BI versus the traditional tools is that it is just so much faster. It's not even just faster. It enables a completely different method of working. It's now completely feasible to sit down with a blank canvas and a business stakeholder and load data like in front of them and begin building the solution in real time, collaboratively with them. And you bypass all of that requirements gathering process. And you also, by the way, bypass the vast majority of the misunderstandings. And also you fast forward the inevitable experience when the business stakeholder sees exactly what they asked for. You've delivered exactly what they asked for. They immediately realize that that isn't good enough. And they don't realize that until they've seen it. And so this iterative process that churns, for weeks and months, sometimes very literally can be compressed into like hours or a single day. And the entire project moves at an order of magnitude greater pace. It's a lot faster, and therefore it's a lot more cost effective. And the results you get, even though it's cheaper and faster and all of that, the results you get are also qualitatively hands down superior to what you would get out of the old method. It's a tool that allows us to actually work the way that human beings are meant to work. And the old tools just failed that test. And I didn't know that until I started to see how these new tools worked, how Power BI worked in the wild. And I'll be honest, even I was surprised. I did not expect it to be this different. When you work on software projects for 13 years, you become a bit of a hardened cynic about the quality of what you're going to produce. It really kind of blew my hair back when I started to experiment with Power BI in the real world and experience how different it actually was.
In terms of the actual workflows for somebody who is building reports within Power BI, there are a number of different aspects that I think we should dig into, one of which being how you handle iterations of a report, where in the sort of Excel world, you might have 15 different copies of the same report stored in a directory with different suffixes of, version 1, version 2, this is the final one, no, now this is the final one. And so that's where a lot of the sort of business intelligence as code comes in, where you can use version control systems to be able to handle that succession and that iteration and be able to go back to different points in time or branch and merge back. What are the capabilities in Power BI for being able to handle that iterative process and be able to do some compare and contrast between version 1 of a report versus version 2 of a report and how well they work, or being able to maintain history of a report so that you can have that context of this is how it changed and why.
The first thing that it does, this isn't terribly unique to Power BI, but the richness that it brings to this story, I think, is unique. But the first thing is that like most consumption of Power BI reports, the way that you do it is one version of the truth style, where it's a published version and you have a URL to it, or you have an app, it's server based. And so you don't get this end user generated proliferation of versions, which you absolutely get in the Excel world. And then the next thing it brings to that is that, like you were saying with the suffixes and everything, like there's a lot of sort of explosion of files in the Excel world that is merely compensating for the shortcomings of Excel. Like Excel is a programming language and it's learnable by business users and it's incredibly flexible. And so that's why it's so ubiquitous. And it's really kind of a wonder of the world. But at the same time, it's kind of a terrible programming language. Like once you view it from a programming language type of standpoint, there's no encapsulation. There's there's no subroutines, And so a single Power BI report will literally answer like almost an infinite combination of questions that you can throw at it. And it will contain, thanks to the in-memory compression engine, it can contain vast quantities of data that'll run very, very cleanly. Whereas, Excel would bog down pretty quickly with even a few months of history sometimes. And so you can have like one mothership essentially of a data model. And that's something we're going to have to talk about is the data model. One mothership of a data model powering a handful of reports, but each one of those reports is serving a role that would traditionally have to have been served by, maybe dozens of sort of traditional SQL-driven reports or Excel reports. So you just, right off the bat, you just knock a couple of zeros off of the quantities involved, and that makes the whole versioning problem becomes just so much more calm and sane as a result. Now, from the development standpoint, if you have multiple developers working on a single Power BI file, I'm still in touch with my buddies at Microsoft, and they don't have good version control. I mean, we have check-in and check-out, but we don't have merge. We don't have change merge yet. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that they've been innovating very, very, very quickly in the file format, and they need to stabilize that. They know about it. Microsoft knows that team-driven development of a shared Power BI model is still one thing that they have to address. It's on their roadmap. I don't know what the timing of it is, but at our company, we have a bunch of consultants that are working in Power BI all the time. And it's amazing how much one person can do on their own. It doesn't actually require a team most of the time to execute a particular project, whereas the traditional world absolutely did require a team. So we don't run into this as often as you would expect, but we still run into it enough that it's like you're sort of having to use like verbal hallway check-in, check-out, like, okay, I'm done making my changes, now you go, that type of thing.
In terms of the access to the data, from when I was looking at the documentation for Power BI, it looks like there are a few different implementations where you've got the desktop app for being able to actually build the reports. You've got the report server if you want to be able to run it in your own environment, or the hosted version where you can publish reports to from the desktop. How do you handle things like access control and security for being able to pull in data sources? And for somebody who's producing the data assets or providing access to those different data sources for the person building the report, how do you handle things like master data management or consistency of definitions for the ways that you should be thinking about the different data assets in terms of how you're structuring the reports?
There were a number of different questions hiding in there. So, first of all, let's start with the only responsible way to share or publish a Power BI report is to publish it to a server. And the cloud product, their cloud service is the runaway number one choice. If you work in an organization that is open to using the cloud, which is basically everyone now, the Power BI cloud service is definitely your best bet. They have that other sort of on-premises server product called Power BI Report Server. And that's useful in cases, primarily where you've got someone that's blocking you from using a cloud service for some reason. The cloud service, by the way, so the desktop app that you use is a Windows-only desktop app. And it is the IDE, essentially. It's where you develop. It's where you develop your Power BI reports and your data models and all that kind of stuff. And it would work as a runtime. You don't want to be seduced by that. You really do want to publish what you build to the server and then point your users to that. And that right off the bat gives you the ability to allow people to interact with it, sort of like it's like read-only. Even though it's interactive, you can change filters, you can drill down, things like that. Yeah, so once it's on the server, you can give people that interactivity without giving them the right to download, essentially the source code. They can't download the thing that you worked on. They can't get a hold of all of the source data. They can't get a hold of the business logic. And then that also gives you the opportunity to provide things like what's called row-level security, which you don't always need, but when you very often do, so that when two people look at the same report, they're only seeing sort of their own corner of the org chart in terms of the data. You don't have to build a separate, you don't have to clone the report for two different people, bake the filter into the report. It can just be a dynamic filter based on who's logging in. Those two, features, they go a long way towards addressing the concerns about putting this out amongst the users, the people who are going to be consuming it, the business users. Then there's the upstream stuff. You were talking about, things like master data management, which, that happens, much further upstream, from the publishing. And, the thing that Power BI is really good at is that it doesn't care where your data is. It has its own internal cache that you can choose to use once you've connected it to things. And most of the time, it's better to use that cache, even when you wouldn't expect it. Once Power BI has connected to your data, it sort of becomes like this, all those data sources. Anything useful is almost always built from multiple data sources as opposed to one. And Power BI is amazing at quickly splicing together, all of your different silos of data in your organization into an integrated all-up view of your business or whatever it is that you're doing. And this allows you to skip a lot of the traditional engineering processes. Like the old tools, even the old tools from Microsoft, it was like step one, get all of the data that you care about into a single instance of SQL Server. What an impractical and unnecessary thing that was. And the reality in the world, I don't think this is at all controversial, is that it's always a blend of sort of like really disciplined, structured sources of data with sometimes a little bit more of the less closely federated data, like like third-party sources, things like the ERP system or whatever that we haven't quite finished integrating into the data warehouse yet. It's never quite done. And so it's very common for us to be working with our clients on solutions that they span all of these, multiple different silos of operational systems, line of business systems, ERP systems, and cobbling together, although cobbling makes it sound so weak, it's actually splicing together for the first time an all-up view. We were working recently with a client, a publicly traded company, built by acquisition, lots and lots of acquisitions that have built them up. And they literally didn't have, for the CEO of this major organization, they did not have a single integrated accounts receivable report. Just no dashboard about how much money they're owed and when by their customers. They've never needed it enough, apparently, but also they've never been able to do it because every single subsidiary had their own AR report. But what does that mean for the overall company? We have no idea. With COVID, all the rules changed, and suddenly it became incredibly crucial that the CEO know, like up to the day level, what their cash flow was going to look like. And they just had never had it before. And we were able to pull that together for them in about 36 hours. So, Power BI itself isn't an answer to the data quality problem. It can integrate with anything that you've got. And it does have some things that help. So like the Power Query language, the M language that Power BI has, it's a language developed by Microsoft for data prepping and cleansing and things like that. They've done a really good job with that tool set, really good job with that language. And they've also set it up with this thing called data flows that allows you to essentially build cloud-based ETL through a GUI even. There's a language that you can hand edit if you want, and oftentimes you need to. And then you can share that data source across multiple different data models, multiple different reports. They're very much aware of kind of the centralization and discoverability problems with these sorts of things. But Power BI doesn't directly address something like master data management. The last thing I will say, though, on the topic is because basically that's upstream from Power BI. You still need it, but it's not something that Power BI directly does for you. You need other tools for that. However, though, bad data quality cannot hide from Power BI for more than a couple of minutes. The places where your data is deficient and might have been deficient for years, undetected, tends to just jump off the page when you're working with it in Power BI. And it's almost annoying. Like when we're working on a project, how quickly sometimes we can become stymied by a data quality issue that has existed forever. We had nothing to do with it. The people we're working with at the company had nothing to do with it. It's just been there forever. But there's a saying that I have, which is that at a company, the only sins that ever get noticed and addressed are ones which significantly interrupt the flow of money. If we stop paying someone, they're going to complain. If we stop getting paid, we're going to complain. Everything else just waits until a good BI tool comes along and people trying to actually see what's going on. And that's where the buck stops. We have a client right now that, what they're doing right now is implementing via Power BI. We discovered that the people in their warehouse weren't and still aren't doing anything remotely resembling a competent job taking inventory. They're just miscoding products left and right. They're mislabeling, unit size, pallets versus cases. And so Power BI has sort of become the reason why there's now a data quality effort afoot. These problems aren't new. They've never been visible before, and they've never actually caused a problem because they weren't monitoring inventory close enough anyway. Now that they're doing it and they're keeping an eye on inventory very closely, now data quality is the problem. And so now we're into the data quality phase on that project, which wasn't anticipated, but it's necessary.
And in terms of being able to monitor the data quality, as you do start to adopt principles to ensure that there is an adequate amount of freshness in the data, that it's getting updated on the right schedule, and understanding what the lineage is of the data flows at the point that you're connecting to them from Power BI, what capabilities does it have for being able to expose that information, whether by pulling from a metadata repository or pulling in the various health signals that you might embed into the records as they're delivered to the destination?
So it's sort of a two-part answer. Power BI is very transparent about where it's getting its data. It's not something that, that it hoards, and it's actually really, it's very centralized in terms of how you would audit a data model. You find a report and you're curious about what's feeding that report. You can trace that to the data model that powers it. And then within the data model, you can then very quickly trace where all of its different data sources come from. And it's very easy to pick up that trail of breadcrumbs at all times. One of the things that we preach is that the expression language that is used to power the reports, which is distinct from, I mentioned M and Power Query, which is basically an ETL language. Dax is a formula expression language to produce numerical results and aggregated results that are then visualized as charts and various visual types on the canvas. This language called Dax is gorgeous. I had nothing to do with it. I didn't have anything to do with building Dax when I was at Microsoft. I had a ringside seat while others were doing it. When I brag about Dax, extol its virtues, it's not self-serving. I wish it was. I wish I had something to do with it, but I didn't. Dax is a real strength of the Power BI product. There's really no one has anything like Dax. There's nothing out there like it. Nothing that can compete with it. Nothing that can touch it. And when you combine that with Power BI's ability to splice across data silos, These are really subtle distinctions that the layperson isn't able to readily appreciate. But the ability to build multi-fact table data models with just quick drag drop without tremendous amounts of infrastructural prep, and then layer over the top of that an expression language as rich and as capable as Dax. You mentioned earlier, like the Lookers and the Tableaus of the world. These are the things that those products don't have. And they also don't have something that measures up to M in Power Query either. Like your Tableau recently started to introduce their own data model feature. Power BI has been a data model powered, multi-silo powered product from the very beginning. And they have a huge, huge, huge lead there. So even though those two products look very similar on the surface, what's under the hood is very different. And I thought that was an important distinction to make, but at the same time, it's relevant to your question as well, which is this Dax expression language. I think even people who get good at it, they tend to underuse it. And one of the things we encourage is to use the Dax expression language to essentially to become like a big part of your automation suite for detecting problems. And we don't even need to distinguish necessarily between data quality problems and real world problems, because sometimes one masquerades as the other, and you need to know about it either way. And so when you build a Power BI solution, in contrast to like if you build something like in R, for instance, everything about Power BI is essentially declarative. You're setting up a structure, a data model structure, and you're developing expressions that represent certain calculations that can then be deployed against that structure, with a click. And so one of the things that we can do with Dax, for instance, is to write essentially like robots in Dax that will go and scan your data at whatever granularity you think is appropriate, and looking for outliers. Outliers can be as simple as just outside of their historical norm by, a certain number of standard deviations or something like that. And it is amazing what this turns up. When a very tiny corner of the data pipeline experiences an outage, and let's say it just starts returning all zeros or something, when you get to the aggregate final dashboard, sometimes that's not apparent. Sometimes that's going to manifest as like a 1% difference in your top level metrics. Other times, everything flatlines and you just know something's wrong. But the subtle ones are the scary ones. Dax, you set up alerts, essentially Dax powered alerts. You can spot things that you would never have looked for. You would never have looked for it. And there are even some horror stories where this is not a data quality problem, where the data quality pipeline was tip top, but the operational system, like entire segments of revenue, went to zero because a system stopped issuing invoices for a particular kind of product. And again, at the top level dashboard for the company, this manifests as maybe like a 2% difference. And that might just be within normal variation month to month, right? So you don't necessarily suspect anything's wrong. But if you've got these formulas that are out there just like churning through and scanning like at hyperspeed, through all kinds of different combinations, even of customer demographics and products. It doesn't even have to be single tables of entities. It can be sort of combinations of entities across different dimensions. And then just reporting the things that are outside normal variation, it's astounding what you'll find. You'll even find fraud. You'll find people stealing. So data quality ends up being, like deliberately overlapped with operational quality. And it's amazing what it'll find.
Equilum's end-to-end data ingestion platform is relied upon by enterprises across industries to seamlessly stream data to operational, real-time analytics, and machine learning environments. Equilum combines streaming change data capture, replication, complex transformations, batch processing, and full data management using a no-code UI. Equilum also leverages open-source data frameworks by orchestrating Apache Spark, Kafka, and others under the hood. Tool consolidation and linear scalability without the legacy platform price tag. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Equilum today, that's EQUALUM, to start a free 2-week test run of their platform. And don't forget to tell them that we sent you. And then another aspect of business intelligence that is frequently a problem is the discoverability of existing reports, where, again, with the Excel situation, you might have multiple people working in their own silos, performing the same calculations and analyses, and even if they're coming up with the same results, they don't know about it, or they might be coming up with slightly different results that ends up causing issues with the decision making. So I'm wondering what capabilities exist within Power BI for being able to surface useful reports and answer questions in terms of making a particular metric visible, or being able to help surface something that is adjacent to or relevant to a particular question that somebody is trying to answer.
Here's where my software cynicism will shine through. In my time at Microsoft, I ended up being party to multiple different features like this that were meant to help people discover and reuse stuff. And it turns out that almost anything that an engineer or software engineering team comes up with, even if they've got, customer research people on the team, whatever we come up with almost never seems to work. The human beings just don't ever seem to cooperate. It's a very sticky problem. And of course, so the Power BI platform has those same features. It has the features you'd expect, search for a report, search for this, search for that. But I mean, unless someone specifically, made you aware of it, it's even hard to get people to use those search features, it turns out. So that sounds really gloom and doom and, we should all give up type of thing. But I actually don't think it's that way, because first of all, finding reports, the reason that this problem existed in the first place is that there were so many reports. And I still think to this day, I talk about this all the time, that the world understands that it needs storage. Of course, we need storage, right? We have to store the data. And then, of course, we need to be able to retrieve it. And you need to even be able to do that just to build operational systems that, that make the business run. Even if you were never going to do any analysis whatsoever, you need storage and retrieval. And so when you start doing BI or analytics or whatever you want to call it, the first team that everyone turns to is the storage and retrieval team. The people who've been doing that kind of work. The vast majority of business intelligence professionals, even to this day, are people whose primary language is SQL. And I know this is changing. Even storage is changing and rapidly every day. But when you have a storage background and a storage, not even the background, it's more the mindset. Reporting services for Microsoft is the most popular product in their history in terms of BI. And it's just a way to basically visualize. You take a SQL query, the result of a SQL query, and render it as HTML. That's essentially its reason for existence. Basically what happens is that every single business question, every interesting business question almost always requires a new report to be built. No report can be built to, like in reporting services, you can't build reports to be self-service. And you also can't build reports to integrate across data sources, which is something that I've been talking about sort of a lot in this discussion. When you think about these reports in terms of how they're actually used, what they're actually used in the end is as export sources for Excel. So if you think of them, instead of as reports, if you think of them as queries, now you understand why you have thousands and thousands and thousands of reports. And most of them haven't been used in years, because a lot of them were commissioned for one particular purpose, used that one time, and then put to bed. So in a Power BI environment, by contrast, a single report is capable of doing literally thousands of times the work as a traditional report can do. And so you might end up still with a lot of reports in your world, a lot of Power BI reports, but a lot is measured with many fewer zeros than in the old world. And because they can splice across data sources, they're not bound to be used purely as export sources for Excel. They actually can answer the question without additional follow-on, cobbling together in Excel. So you end up with a much smaller number, and then you have this thing called usage. So because it's server published and you've got usage data, the admin team, and maybe multiple levels of admin team, can absolutely be watching and monitoring what sorts of reports and data models are being built, who's using them. And it becomes a bit more of an oversight function to say to teams A and B, hey, do you know that you're both using something very similar? You're both reinventing the wheel. Let's talk about consolidating those things. Whereas reuse It just doesn't come natural. Like people don't go out of their way to search for something that's already there. I think that the world that we're landing in now is actually much more realistic in terms of, because that's what you really want in the end. You don't want wasted effort, right? And so in a Power BI environment, the centralization in particular models and their flexibility combined with the oversight component through usage statistics that the admins can monitor, I think that's really the way to go. That's how we do it.
As far as your work with clients in your consultancy, for people who are looking to take on a business intelligence effort or improve their visibility into their operations through building these reporting dashboards and analytics, what are some of the common points of confusion or frustration that they encounter in being able to represent things effectively and provide the information in a way that is constructive to their end goals?
We could do a whole hour on that one question. Let me pick one thing. So one of the things that I recommend to people is that we not talk about our reports even as reports. We stop thinking about our jobs as being like our mission. We tend to think of our mission in BI as, it's right there in the name, intelligence, right? It's information. And no, we're not. We're not in that business. None of us are in that business. We're in the business improvement. That's our real discipline, is business improvement. And no report is worth anything until or unless it translates into improved behavior. And, okay, that sounds obvious, like it's a meaningless statement, but it's kind of everything when you make that your focus. So instead of starting with the data and working forward into what kinds of reports you can build from it, if you start instead with thinking about the stakeholders, the people who are actually going to be using this thing when you're done with it, and you work backwards from what is their daily workflow? What are the decisions that they have to make or can make on a daily basis? What knobs do they have? Do they have a knob that says increase production, decrease production, open new stores, close stores, whatever? It turns out that, especially in larger organizations, every role has a finite number of controls that they've got. I like to imagine them sitting at something like a bat computer with these gigantic 1960s pop art buttons and levers on it. And what are the labels on those things? Like I said, like increase production, decrease production is a really simple example. And if you work backwards from that, with that mindset, you actually end up building something completely different. You don't end up building reports. You end up building sort of action loop advisors. You end up building things that directly influence or assist them in making decisions and improvements. And like a report oftentimes tries to do everything by being your source of information on everything. And in the process, it ends up being good at nothing. And when you think backwards from the action, this is really just acknowledging the fact that even reports and data models are software. You're using a Power BI software platform to build it, but they are software in their own right. And you'd never build software, if you think about it as just like a software engineering practice, you wouldn't build software without getting to know your users. You wouldn't build software without getting to know what their pain points are. You wouldn't build software without understanding what your users are, your audience, what they're leaving on the table. It's a hard thing to do justice without some anecdotes, but we have a lot of stories about how dramatically things have shifted with our clients when they replace the report mindset with the improvement mindset.
Also, in terms of your experience consulting with various companies who might be across different business domains or verticals, what have you found to be the necessity for particular domain expertise with the problem space that they're working in? And how much of your experience in data modeling and visualization and report generation have you found to be broadly applicable across those different domains?
Yeah. So really great question. First of all, I mentioned earlier, near the beginning, that you can sit down with the stakeholder and develop in real time. One of the key advantages of that is that you're now executing this project at distance zero from the subject matter expert, from the domain expertise. Like you're not the domain expert. I'm certainly not the domain expert. None of our consultants are in any particular, company. The people we're working with at that client, those people are the subject matter experts there. And to have them, in the room in real time as this thing evolves is critical. This is where the improved quality comes from. It's amazing. So the old world, we had the technical skills to execute and the subject matter expertise of the business at great distance from each other, communicating through a very, very low bandwidth, like 2400 baud modem, right? And now we've got like this, gigabit connection between the two because we're sitting in the same room, and it's just night and day different. It's not just faster; it's very different. Just like today's internet is incredibly different for 2400 baud internet. The other question is how, from our team's perspective, how important is particular expertise in an industry? It's really funny. Like the most important thing is, one of the things that we explicitly hire for is the ability to very quickly understand a particular business and its needs rapidly. And our consultants, the ones that, you could think of them as the developers, they're the ones who develop this, these solutions. They are also these communicators. We don't split those two roles at our company for good reason, because as you split those roles, you're introducing more communication cost and more inertia into the system, and you can't move at the pace that you would if it was just all in one brain. But here's the funny thing. Once you have that plasticity, it turns out that, let's say we have a manufacturing client and they insist on someone from our team that's worked with a number of manufacturing clients. And we go along with that. We send someone that's manufacturing expertise. What'll turn out is that the particular problem that we're dealing with at that moment might not be one that our consultant has seen before. Just because it's in manufacturing, that covers a lot of ground. It doesn't mean that it's going to be the same thing over and over again. In fact, one time I was working for a large, one of the big four accounting firms, and did some work for them many years ago in Power BI. We were building a tax model on first in, first out, FIFO accounting. And we don't need to go into the details of it. Some people will know what that means. Some people won't. Obviously, FIFO is probably familiar, but with respect to accounting, it might not be something you've heard before. But anyway, it's pretty interesting. It's probably what you'd expect. Years later, teaching a class, someone took me aside during a break and was asking me some questions about food. They were in a food distribution business, and they were asking me questions about modeling spoilage in their warehouses. And it turned out to be exactly the same problem as the FIFO accounting problem for selling securities and for tax purposes and things like that. So it turns out that the places where experience matter the most is, number one, you've got to have the subject matter expert from that business in the room with you. And then secondly, it's the patterns, it's the data patterns that you get exposed to over time that make the difference.
In terms of your experience working on the Power BI product and building it at Microsoft, and now running a business to help support its end users, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in that process?
First of all, is that none of it works the way that I thought it did. I went to college and then went straight to Microsoft. And so, it was only like in 2010 that I first ventured out into the real world. I kind of left the bubble, the controlled environment. The good news, bad news, the most shocking thing for me, just how far we have to go. Because we work at such a fast pace, we burn through projects. We get through them as fast as possible for our clients. That means by necessity, to stay in business, we have to see a lot in a year. We work with a lot of clients. The velocity of our business is just orders of magnitude different from the traditional firm that operates in our space. And that's our big differentiator. So we get to survey, one of the side effects of that is that we get to survey the world at a pace that most people don't get to see. We get to see a lot. We get to see a tremendous amount of breadth. And, everyone we work with, not everyone, but close to everyone, they feel like this, you can just see it in them. And they'll even say it explicitly sometimes. It's sort of like, they'll say like, oh yeah, we're really primitive here. We're really primitive at this company. We're way behind the curve. But everyone's saying that. And they wouldn't know that because, everyone generally, you work on average for like 5 years at a company. You just don't get the exposure that we do. Everything is in the dark ages still. When you read, magazines and things like that from the industry, and you listen to, the analysts from Gartner, et cetera, talk, there's a sexiness to talking about the next big thing. The next big thing is this. The next big thing is that. And, all of those things that are talked about, they're valuable and they have their place. But what I have found, to my utter surprise, is that the next big thing in analytics, in business intelligence, the next big thing is doing the basics right for the first time ever. And we are still in the earliest phases of that. We have some clients that we've worked with for a number of years. And for them, we've watched them mature. We've watched them mature from, not having the basics. The things that everyone assumes, when I work at company X, I assume every other company in the world has the basics done right. And they don't. When you start to get the basics done right for the first time ever, that's when you start to realize that BI is really just part of a bigger ecosystem. It's part of like I was talking about earlier, it's a crucial component in improvement. And that means action. And so it's really rewarding and gratifying to see our clients that we work with sort of after getting a hold of the BI problem and actually making significant strides against it and getting it into a place where they actually turn around after a little while and they say, okay, what next? And that what next question is just absolutely, it's just what a good feeling, because the world's never gotten to next. BI has never gotten caught up what it was always meant to be in the first place. So I think that's the most surprising thing to me is just how much work, and the good news for people listening to this podcast is that how much opportunity remains. It's like a gold rush that's out there, and you don't necessarily have to be doing the absolute most advanced machine learning, that kind of thing to be part of that gold rush. And we do that kind of stuff too, but majority of our business is doing the things that are just really fundamental. When I say basics, it's not really basics. It's like the things that we should take for granted, in terms of what we can see through our business data. We've never gotten there as a society, but we're getting there now.
For people who are considering what business intelligence solution to go with and they're interested in Power BI, what are the cases where it's the wrong choice?
The cases where it's the wrong choice end up being more like when you do view it like as a programming language. I'll give you an example. As powerful as Dax is, Dax doesn't have recursion. There's no concept of recursion in Dax, which we take for granted in procedural programming languages. Right off the bat, you think of all the different places where you use recursion if you're a programmer. You go, oh, well, if it can't do recursion, then it can't do what I want. Well, it turns out that even like 90% of those cases, the features of Dax allow you to do those things without requiring recursion. For example, you never have to worry about sort. Sort is just built into the engine, and ranking and all that kind of stuff. It's all just built into the engine. So you don't have to worry about any of those kinds of things where you might, program your own recursion. But there are occasional problems where you have to calculate one result to feed forward into the next result, into the next result, into the next result, into the next result. And the way I would describe it is, and this is also a contrast with Excel, because Excel can actually do this pretty well in general. If you have a small amount of input data and then a set of rules, and then from that small amount of input data and set of rules, you produce a larger amount of data, Power BI is not a good tool for that. Simple example of this would be like an Excel-based income statement where you sort of like are simulating what the business might look like in 12 years, or not in 12 years, in 24 months. If you add 2 customers a month for the first 6 months and then 3 customers a month, and then you lose some 20% of them each month, attrition rates and things like that. That is, you start with a small amount of real data or assumptions, and then you use rules to generate 24 months of data. You end up with more square footage of data than you started with. That's not a good Power BI scenario. Power BI is the other thing. Power BI goes the other way. You start from larger amount of data and you crunch it down to a smaller amount of data, like a set of metrics that then might be, visualized as charts, but like you end up with a smaller set of numbers than what you originally had. And a lot of recursive solutions are the kind that need to produce a lot of data as intermediate steps and then feed that forward into the subsequent steps. There is some sort of mathematical proof that all recursion can be turned into iteration, transformed into iteration. And, Dax has a lot of iteration in it. There's a lot of iterative functions in Dax. It's really good at that. But I mean, sometimes I've tried some of these sometimes where like you start to feel like you're doing like differential equations, like Laplace transforms. You're trying to like restate your recursive problem as an iterative problem. And it just gets really hairy. So in all the years that we've been working with this, we've only run into this probably 3 or 4 times. And I think it's because those sorts of problems tend to be solved with other tools by default anyway. We kind of always have our antenna deployed to try to sense when something like that's going to happen. Triple exponential smoothing. Yeah, you're not going to do that in Dax. It's just not that kind of thing.
Are there any other aspects of the Power BI platform or your experience helping people adopt it and utilize it effectively, or the overall business intelligence space that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
I think it's just, maybe it's worth mentioning that it's just like almost criminally inexpensive. The desktop tool for developing and testing is completely free. The cloud service product is $10 a month per user. Microsoft prices for the enterprise. Microsoft is always looking, for the 10,000 seat account, the 10,000 seat customer. They have to price at that level. And even if you work at a huge company, the departmental cost for Power BI, it's just so dirt cheap. It's an amazing tool. I say this all the time. I don't work for Microsoft anymore. I'm as much of a Microsoft cynic as I am a patriot. They don't pay me anymore. If there was a better tool out there, my company would be using it. And we're not. We're using this one because it is the best. We believe it. For that thing that we believe to be the best, for that thing to be the most affordable product on the planet, it's just so counterintuitive. It's almost like you'd be more interested in it if it was 10 times as expensive. Some of the things going on in the innards of Power BI, the only things in my entire Microsoft career that felt like science fiction. Couldn't believe some of the things that they were pulling off, like the speed, the performance, the data capacity that they were able to pull off. This thing, Microsoft has a reputation as being, kind of like almost like the IBM of old, right? Like it's corporate and it's, vanilla and boring. And they name their products terribly boring names, I'll tell you, Power BI is incredibly sophisticated, incredibly cutting edge under the hood. It's still not matched. And on top of that, it costs next to nothing. So the cost of entry is really low. But please, 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 if you start messing around with it, you've got to understand that it's not like SQL. You don't want to feed it one big wide table. You want to feed it separate tables representing each particular data source, each type of transaction, each type of inventory, and each type of entity like, customer or product line or things like that. And then relating these tables together to produce a dynamic data model. Because when you start doing all of your work in SQL or whatever storage language you like, to feed it into Power BI, you tend to follow some of the old practices of reporting languages. And when you do that, you end up throwing out a tremendous amount of the value of Power BI. So, you've got to understand, it's not hard, but you've got to understand what it is to build a data model. And you need to be building basically a star schema under the hood and not big, wide, flat views.
For anybody who does want to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as a final question, I would just like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
I think that the biggest gap is that, and Microsoft is somewhat early to this party, even though they still have a lot of work to do. The biggest gap is that thing I was talking about earlier, which is that the recognition that BI is really just part of the improvement cycle. And so it needs to translate into action. And, we tend to think of our reports as standalone applications. Probably don't even think of them that way, but we think of them as islands in a way. You go in there and you ask some questions and you get some answers, and then you leave and you go do something. And I think that, let's say 5 years from now, maybe less, we will see organizations like Gartner and Forrester. They will be including in their evaluation criteria as a top level criteria, how closely taking action is integrated or can be integrated into the dashboards. If I recognize that particular product line is running low on inventory, for instance, that's what I find out in a report. Why do I have to pick up the phone or go look somebody up or leave that environment to go to a different system and navigate to the right spot in that system? Like, the report knows, in a sense, it knows the identifying information. And like, why don't we have instead, a button or a link or some sort of verb right there in the report that says, increase production level, on this date, we want to make X more. Or at bare minimum, navigate me to the right place, like go log me in to the other system and take me to the right page and set the filters appropriately so that I'm looking at the right product line on the right production day so that I can take that action. And I think we're gonna start to think of BI and reports and dashboards as much more of a crossroads as opposed to just like a one-way flow of information. And this is, again, one of the things that we see with our clients after they've had, a year or two of maturing in sort of this new form of BI, the one that actually works. This is where their gaze inevitably turns next, as they start saying, how do we integrate more action into this? And then you circle back to the technology and you say, okay, what does the technology offer me in this regard? This will be a theme that I'm sure you'll be hearing, the various vendors are going to start pounding the table about this. Microsoft kind of already is. But yeah, I think that's sort of the next frontier is just, again, it's one of those fundamental things that we just never have gotten around to. But it's crucial. It's absolutely crucial.
Thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and discuss your work with Power BI, both at Microsoft and as a consultant. It's definitely a very interesting platform, and I appreciate your insights and enthusiasm. So thank you again for all of your time and effort, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Likewise, it's been my pleasure.
Listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, podcast.init, at pythonpodcast.com to learn about the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used. And visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. If you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.